Welcome to Not Just Money with your hosts, Doretta and Li. This isn't your typical podcast about finances. It's a podcast about all the money conversations we aren't having, sometimes not even with ourselves. Join us on this journey of hard truths, lived experience, and the wisdom that comes from both. Because money is never just about money.
Hey Lee, you ready to talk housing?
What would happen if I said, not really? I mean, okay, I feel like housing can be so polarizing and everyone has a different perspective, but I've poured myself a cup of green tea, so I am ready as I will ever be.
Oh yeah, I mean, we picked homeownership for today's topic because it does seem to be the subject of every second personal finance article these days.
Like everywhere,
I know.
everywhere,
And I
like
just,
on all topics.
I just think about how many articles we have sent back and forth between us on this topic. So I guess we figured we pretty much had to weigh in.
Yeah, and I think it's also because it's getting more ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, we find that you have to ask some very specific questions, and I don't think they're being asked, at least not in the right way. Because, and I know we've talked about this between us, I just don't think home ownership is necessarily the be all and the end all when it comes to securing our financial futures.
I mean, you say it all the time, and with each new article link you send me. And even though I'm on record, even here in our podcast, about how important housing was to me personally, home ownership, because of all these security issues that I have,
Yeah.
I actually agree with that. And I think also, in addition to making sure we're asking the right questions, I think it's also really useful to challenge some of the assumptions around homeownership. So, to be clear, there are basic truths and real issues here. So, the first is the conventional wisdom around the relationship between homeownership and financial security. And that looks something like this. You buy a house, and through the enforced discipline of paying off the mortgage, you pay it off by the time you retire, and then you will be able to live, happily ever after on a pension and savings with
Cute.
significantly reduced living costs on your paid off home. And let's
Uh-huh.
be honest, that is a formula that has generally worked really well for boomers and Gen Xers, especially since, let's be honest, we've seen huge increases in the value of those houses.
But also true, housing prices have outstripped wage gains over the last couple of decades. The
Yeah.
numbers don't lie. And that has made it really hard for millennials of my generation and now Gen Z to get into the housing market. And that becomes a story that goes something like this. For generations, Canadians have been told that home ownership is a primary adult milestone and really kind of a national norm, at least a middle class norm, and upper class, it goes without saying. It's the key to building household wealth, the cornerstone of a secure retirement, all that stuff.
And then the story continues with deep psychological consequences. A big betrayal of your millennial generation and of Gen Z coming up behind you. You're being shut out of the Canadian dream because housing prices have risen so much faster than wages. And again, to be clear, it is absolutely true that millennials and now the leading edge Gen Zs have a lower rate of home ownership than boomers or Gen X at the same age. You just have to look at the census data to see the difference. I mean, look at home ownership of 25 to 39-year-olds, which is the prime time for buying first-time homes historically. And the census data looks like this. You look at the baby boomers in 1991 census, 55.9% of households were owned. You look at you look at Gen X. We all forget about Gen X. You look at Gen X in 2006, and actually, homeownership was even higher, 56.2%. But millennials in 2021, 49%. Now, those are average numbers. And actually, it's way more extreme in major urban centers. In Toronto, the home price to income ratio went from 4, which is considered healthy, to about 10 between 1994 and 2004. And in Vancouver, which was always crazy expensive to start with, it went from 8 to 14. Like, that is
Holy
insane.
cow.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Now, there are a bunch of other things we know to be true about millennials and Gen Zs, though whether or not they are caused by housing prices, I think that's still up for debate.
Such as?
Well, the demographic trends that we've been seeing for a while, moving out of parents' homes later, putting off marriage, children, if they marry or have kids at all.
I think there could be other social factors at work there as well. I mean, people are staying in the education system a lot longer, and I
Yeah.
think it has become the social norm to get established in your career before you have kids, like those, milestones that we talk about. And honestly, my observation is that an awful lot of couples don't marry until they make the kid decision. In my case, it was kind of after, but that's another story. And I think that's a pretty significant social change because then that all means we're a lot older. And also, we've had a lot of immigration from countries where multi generational living is much more the norm. Maybe it doesn't have the same stigma that it used to.
Another thing, though, is that I think there's a change between the idea that this is sequential. I just saw a big article about this morning. The idea that you sequence career, home ownership, family formation, children. Whereas historically, that's been something you did all at the same time. It wasn't, kids were not a barrier to do these things. It was just like you did it all at once. But anyway, the reality is the difference is dramatic. So for example, in the last census data, 2021, percentage of millennials who were living with their parents was literally double the rate that it was for baby boomers. Is that because of housing costs, cultural reasons? I have no idea. I expect housing costs are certainly part of it. But, speaking personally, I know exactly two people who are still living with their parents at that age. A cousin of mine who lived with her widowed father until his death, and a cousin of my husband's who lived with his or her widowed mother. Same thing. Other than that, every single person I knew had long flown the nest. Okay, so we've made it clear that on the whole, homeownership scenario is absolutely different for millennials and Gen Zs than it was for boomers and Gen X. And I think we also need to note and to question some of the doomsaying that's come out of that reality. That there's no point in saving because you'll never be able to buy a house. And if you can't buy a house, what's the point?
Yeah. And that underlying assumption that homeownership is the only way to secure your financial future, I think we need to ask different questions and really question, as you will say, the data.
Well, that's how the current understanding goes, isn't it? That for generations, homeownership has been the cornerstone of financial security for Canadians. And
Yeah.
concurrent with that and reinforcing that renting is just throwing money away on other people's mortgages.
Yeah, I've certainly heard and read and heard and read that more times than maybe either of us can count.
Well, what if it isn't true?
Well, what do you mean?
Well, so for fun information, unchallenge that with a little bit of history. It doesn't change the reality of today's situation, okay? But it does provide some really cool information and maybe some thoughts about future direction.
Oh boy. I'm hearing another rabbit hole
Oh,
story here. So, which hole did you go down this time?
come on. There are always rabbit holes with my name on it. Um,
Everywhere. Everywhere.
the history of homeownership in Canada rabbit hole. So
Huh.
I asked myself, is it really true that homeownership has always been the cornerstone of financial security for Canadians? And do you know what? It hasn't been. It's a post World War II phenomenon. And maybe, just maybe, boomers and Gen X's, we always forget about Gen X's, are actually the anomalies. Because before World War II, owning a house was really, really, really hard. And in cities, most people actually always lived in rented apartments and rooming houses.
Okay, back up here. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so home ownership is not some kind of universal norm. Before World War II, people who lived in cities were largely renters. The housing boom, especially for the growing middle class, did not start in Canada until the 1950s, literally within living memory.
So, then what prompted the change?
Post war boom. It wasn't just a baby boom, which is where we boomers got our name. Everything
Right.
boomed, okay? Everything, not just the number of babies. It was a time of enormous economic change, huge economic and technological growth. Does that sound familiar?
Well, we're certainly living in a time of huge economic and technological change. I'll give you that. But I think the jury is kind of out on the growth part, at least as far as job creation and stability that we've really seen in the last few years.
Fair. But I think it's important to understand that the 1950s, 60s, 70s were really extraordinary times in Canada as well as in the US. We had the people, the technology, the land, the financial instruments, and the public policy that all went together to fuel economic growth and build enormous wealth. And remember, unlike Europe and some other parts of the world as well, post World War II, our cities had not been flattened by bombs.
But how did it work in terms of housing? Like market forces, supply and demand?
Yeah, no. Don't think that it was just the market at work. It wasn't. It was public policy. After the war, with all the returning veterans, governments at all levels actually saw housing as public infrastructure, like roads and bridges, and they invested in it. The post war housing boom was heavily subsidized. There was a National Housing Act, CMHC was created. Building homes
Right.
was this huge public private partnership, and it was not purely profit driven.
Ha
Governments
ha
were
ha.
involved, yeah, exactly. Governments were
Yikes.
involved in public and not for profit housing, cooperatives, etc. And then you had cheap land and cheap gas that combined to open up the suburbs. And here's
Right.
another thing. There were new financial tools. This is so cool. It always surprises me just how critical financial instruments are to economic growth and wealth building. So mortgages worked completely differently.
I think we often forget how short of a time frame our current financial world has existed. We think the financial systems we have now have always been, but a lot of it is what, around, I don't know, 50, 80 odd years?
It's
Like
that.
you said, yeah, even if historically home ownership wasn't a thing, that's not the reality we are in now.
Yeah, but yeah, agreed. But just think about what it was like before World War II. Mortgages were insanely hard to get. You think they're hard now? There wasn't
Yeah.
any government program. Banks were not involved in residential mortgages. Did you know chartered banks weren't even allowed to issue residential mortgages until the mid 1950s? And
Yeah,
even
and
then,
that living memory, that's
yeah,
living
yeah,
memory, right? We
yeah.
forget that.
And even then, they had to be insured. And the mortgages before that were generally held either by insurance companies or private individuals. And get this,
Wow.
you generally needed a 50% down payment and to pay back the rest of it over 10 years. So think about that in terms of what it meant and what it meant to homeownership to ordinary people. We've talked about this before, how things are so much more flexible today, even than they were like 30 years ago. There are just all kinds of different ways to finance things, all of that kind of stuff.
So then government involvement in housing policy is nothing new. And I also think longevity wasn't the same expectations too. Like our ability to live longer has really ballooned with the advancement of science, and that plays a role too.
Yeah, absolutely. There are people who would actually argue that one of the reasons we're in the mess we're in today is because governments at all levels basically withdrew from supporting housing as infrastructure.
One more thing to blame our public institutions for.
Right. Look, I could go on and on and on because this was a really deep rabbit hole. But the point I want to make is this: the home ownership model that emerged after World War II came out of really unique economic conditions. And the story of home ownership is now so pervasive that we've forgotten it's actually quite a new thing.
It's still how we see the world. It shapes our expectations.
Yeah, well, have you ever read William Faulkner, my favorite American author? The past is never dead. It isn't even past.
Oh boy, not sure what to do with that. But What is it you're saying that your generation lucked in and mine's basically out of luck and the generations after me are further down Shit's Creek?
You really wanna say that. You really wanna go there into that completely unproductive spiral. I just wanted to give some context and to challenge the narrative that housing is the only cornerstone of financial security, and also share cool stuff that I learned. But anyway, because that has not been true for a long time in Canada, and it's not true in many other countries even today, notably those that still see housing primarily as just a place to live and not a financial asset.
Yeah, a home as a place to live. That is so fundamentally important. I mean, growing up, I lived a very common immigrant story. Like, my parents came with very little in their early 40s. They were professionals in China, but could never translate that into meaningful careers here. My dad retrofitted my uncle's garage, and that's where we lived for many years. Then we rented. But there was more than one occasion where we were evicted because of a home sale or whatever was happening. And living like that, when you'll be kicked out at any point has like deep psychological effect on a person. But honestly, before I bought my first place, there was also a lot of fear of setting down roots. I think personally it can be very complicated for each of us. So for me, I went through all the emotions and really asked myself what it is that I wanted. When I did buy my first property, it was the bare minimum that I needed because my mom was retiring and we wanted to travel, and I didn't have enough money to do both and not be in debt. But then I had to deal with like the cultural condemnation of a small place. I routinely got, "Oh, we thought you were successful." But mom and I went and traveled to 7 continents before I turned 32. And this is a very roundabout way of saying that you have to ask yourself why you own or rent and what it really matters to you. You have to live somewhere, but you also still have to save for retirement. There's just so much demands on limited, finite resources. And early in my career, I was given this advice, and it still holds true forever. The value of your primary residence should not count towards your wealth. You have to live somewhere. So if you are using mortgage payments as forced savings and leaving it at that, you are ill prepared for the future. And that is the truth. When I do my retirement count, I do not factor my housing into that equation. I do only if I want a total net worth picture, but not on future funds that I can draw on. Homes are illiquid. If I was in a jam, it wasn't going to feed me overnight.
My first boss gave me exactly that same lecture back in the housing bubble in the 1980s. He just told me the same thing, homes are for living in, and I also separate out my home from investable assets, which are the ones that really
Yes,
matter.
exactly.
Liquidity, right? It really matters to
Mhm,
be able to have actual real money to buy actual real things that you need, food, that kind of thing.
mhm, mhm.
We've all heard the term house poor. I think something that millennials and Gen Zs don't always realize is that there are way too many seniors who may seem to be financially fine on paper, have, living in Toronto in a small house that's worth over $1 million. But really, everything they have is actually tied up in that house, and they are struggling day to day, and they can't even afford to move.
My concern is that buying a home as the cornerstone of building financial security and building wealth has become the default. That may have made good sense for your generation, but I'm not convinced it necessarily does for mine. But because it has become so entrenched as the default, it's led to a lot of really unhealthy financial behaviors. From taking on too much house because you feel like you need to make sure you don't miss out, and too much risk as a result, to giving it up altogether and living frivolously because there's just no point. It's like these huge ends of the spectrum. And the thing is, I don't think people are even asking themselves the right question. They start with questions like, how much can I afford? And that may not be the best place to start.
Where would you start?
I think by asking yourself why you want to buy a home at all. Before you even start thinking about numbers, and neighborhoods, and school districts, start with what you want from life. Then calculate that cost before you figure out how much you have left over. This is why many become house poor and stressed and unhappy. When you are so over leveraged, you have to give up the things that probably actually make you happy. We have said this before. Our money isn't infinite, it's about choices. Because I'll tell you something interesting. While home ownership has proved to be a good strategy for many, not least because of what some call the enforced saving of mortgage repayment, it's not the only way to build wealth. Now, it's pretty hard to compare returns on residential real estate and the stock market because there's so many variables. But over the past 25 years, if we look at an apples to apples comparison of 300,000 cash invested in the average Canadian household and 300,000 invested in the S&P TSX Composite Total Return Index, which reinvests dividends, that's an important fact, the house loses. The index returned an average 9% per year. The house returned 4.7% to 5.5% in high competitive markets of Toronto and Vancouver. Now, there are a whole lot of other factors to consider, like liquidity and diversification and risk and ongoing costs and tax treatment, etc. But my point is, if the primary reason you're obsessing about homeownership is because you feel you have to, or that it's the best, safest investment, you're wrong based on the numbers because there are other ways to build wealth. Just saying.
I think this is one of the areas where housing represents something really different for different generations. And I expect that for boomers and to a certain extent Gen X, houses still were primarily about buying a place to live, shelter, stability, the long term saving. You bought a house, you paid it off, and you stayed there. But it seemed to me that for millennials and Gen Z, housing is less about home and more about investment and status and competition. And there's so much more anxiety connected to it.
Well, to be fair, we have had to take on a lot more debt
Yep.
relative to income than you did.
Yep.
But I agree, there is a psychological difference. There's so much pressure and fear of missing out, right? Not getting into the market in time. And there's the whole thing of ownership being tied to identity and as a symbol of adulthood. I also think it has to do with the lessons your generation left us. You've passed your truths down to us. But that leads me to the next important question. If you do want to buy a home, how much do you need? And I mean really need. Separate this out from the social or the social media pressures of what you think you should have to be quote unquote successful. Like, if there's only two of you and you need 4 bedrooms, huh? I mean, everyone has their own office. Can you share? Now, my office is in the corner of my bedroom, and it suits me just fine as long as there's a full active blur. I realize if you do not blur your camera, you can absolutely see that I never make my bed. And personally, I refuse to pay for something I'm not using. And I know Doretta likes to tease me about it. But when my husband and I were house hunting, any home with a huge hallway or wasted space, like a pillar that cut off too much of a room, was an automatic no. Remember that you have to pay for every inch, whether you use it or not. And forever. Think property taxes or maintenance fees. And my family makes fun of me. There is a space behind my door in my bedroom. It's a very small corner. And I have purposefully put in a box that is filled with decorations and birthday stuff, whatever, just random things. But it has become storage because I think if I've paid for it, it must be utilized.
Yes. I have to say, where you really see the truth of this is if you move into a condo, and both you and I live in condos, right? Your maintenance
Yeah.
fees are literally set at on a square foot basis. That's how you pay. So every one of that you are literally paying for in a very obvious way.
But
But
also
yeah,
property taxes for
property
homes, right?
taxes, yep. Yep. I and I agree. I think that how much do I really need? is a really important question. And I admit, I am from the generation of bigger's better in terms of square footage, etc. And to be honest, I never questioned that. It's just the way it was. But I'm very aware now. Remember, more house is more cost, and it's not just actually mortgage and taxes and maintenance fees. It's more energy costs. It's the cost of actually more stuff to fill it, more maintenance, more work, more time. So you
Mhm.
got to ask yourself, like, do you own your home or does it own you? Next question.
Yeah, I think after you've been honest about what is important to your life and how much house do you need versus what you want, again, needs versus wants, always coming up. The next question for me is how much can you really afford? Really. And I do not mean what the bank tells you you can afford. We've been over that ground before.
There are standard formula, right? Like, if you don't have a lot of debt, you have a 20% down payment, 3.5 to 4 times your gross annual income. Interesting that I think that's different. I think for my generation, it was 25% and 3 times gross income, but whatever.
Yeah, I think you have to decide for yourself what you're comfortable with and leave yourself some leeway. But these days, I've seen that go as high as 6 times, which is starting to get super sketchy. I think it's important to keep in mind other factors in the future. It's one thing to be optimistic and think that my income will rise as I progress in my career and I can cover the difference. But really, what happens when you have an economic downturn or even a crazy interest rate rise that we have personally seen and felt in the last few years? This is where it's important to also have set up an emergency fund. Don't empty all of your accounts just so that you can say you've bought your dream home. Not a dream home if you can't afford to live in it or to keep it. And one thing that really concerns me is when banks and mortgage brokers tell you not to worry about the size of your mortgage, just whether you can manage the monthly payments. No thank you.
One emerging trend that I think is really concerning in this area is the growing dependence on the bank of mom and dad for help in buying a home. There's a whole narrative that unless you've got some family money behind you, you're never gonna be able to get into the real estate market.
It seems somewhere north of 40% of first time home buyers are getting cash from their parents. And to add to that, something like 16% of young buyers using inheritances.
And basic demographics tells us that that's a number that's gonna keep growing as we baby boomers pop off.
Yikes. Thanks for that one. But from the land of the living, I saw a Bank of Canada study that the number of parents co signing mortgages for their kids has almost tripled in the last 20 years, from 4% in 2004 to 11% last year. And that is a trend that is maybe even more worrisome.
Yeah, I think so. That one really got to me too on 2 points. I mean, first and obvious is just that it's so many. But the second, when you dive into the data, is that home buyers who were using their parents to co-sign when they were buying bought more expensive houses. So it's one thing if your parents can afford to gift you money for a down payment. Although we know we're actually seeing parents that are putting their own retirements at risk to give money to their kids to buy houses.
Yep,
But
yep.
one of the things that the data was showing with these cosign situations. So remember, that's a cosign. The parent is not actually putting up money, but they may have to. It shows
Yeah.
that 74% of buyers with cosigners would not have qualified for the mortgage without parental support. And when you consider the impact of that leverage, okay, the difference between the house these young people could actually qualify for with and without a parental cosigner is enormous. It's like over 70% because that's what leverage does, right?
70%? That's enormous.
Yeah. Yeah. So they qualify on average for something like 460,000 without a cosigner and 785,000 with a cosigner. Crazy, right?
Bananas.
Now,
Bananas.
Now, what they actually bought was on average 709,000. So on average, they did not go to their max, but they did buy about $250,000 more than they could qualify for on their own. And then if you look at people who are not getting, like first-time buyers who were not getting a cosign, they were spending $90,000 more than the average price of first-time home buyers who didn't have a cosigner. And that is scary. It actually is starting to threaten some foundational stuff. I mean, think about what it means to stretch yourself that thin. It's the inherent danger in that kind of leverage. So if there was an increase in interest rates, a financial emergency, not only would they go down, but they are going to take their parents down as well. Their parents are going to be on the hook. It could threaten retirement security for their parents as well.
Yeah, it's bad decision making all around. And when you have an investment mindset about housing, you see that leverage as a way to build wealth faster. But what if that price goes down? I'd like to point out that house prices in the GTA dropped 6 to 7% last year alone.
I remember the investment fuel bubble that burst in the late 80s. So economists use it as a cautionary tale. A lot of you won't remember this, but in the GTA, housing prices more than doubled. I think it was actually close to 150% between 1985 and 1989. And then that bubble burst, and it burst hard, and it burst fast. And housing prices did not return to those 1989 levels until 2002. That is 13 years, people. So if the reason you bought a house was purely as an investment, then you can do the math.
Wow. Okay. So the point here is be very honest about how much house you can really afford and stick to that. But I do worry that when we look at financial gifts, co signing, and inheritances, either money or an actual house, even, that the divide is going to get bigger and bigger of who can own and who, quite frankly, can never own. Those are the details that worry me long term. And perhaps we have to change our mindset against that backdrop to say that homeownership is no longer the path forward for financial stability. Okay, final question I would ask: how does home ownership fit with my overall financial plan? Because remember, even if you do buy a home, it won't secure your financial future on its own. You still have to save for retirement, for your kids' education, if you have any, for your emergency fund. And that is on top of the fact that you still need to, live and enjoy life.
I think some people get so focused on home ownership that they think it's all it takes to secure their financial future. But if home ownership takes up so much of your income that you can't afford to save otherwise, what do you do then?
Then you look at other options. Maybe depending on your age and situation, it makes sense to continue to live with your parents. There's no shame in that. And there are also a lot of innovative solutions emerging there, from basement apartments to laneway houses, etc., where a more modest investment can get you privacy and autonomy. But there's also the obvious option of renting. And I think too many people in Canada don't take renting seriously, or they attach some kind of social stigma to it. Or you're going to have to figure out how to earn more, right? Change jobs, get a side hustle. It's not always on the make do with your income. You can work at increasing it, but that can be harder to do.
So, renting. How many times have you heard or read that renting's just throwing money away?
I know, and it's nonsense. Sheer nonsense. Renting is just getting you a place to live. Yes, there are trade offs, but there are trade offs to homeownership too. And remember, we all have to live somewhere.
Okay, so let's take a look at the pros and cons of buying versus renting. And I'll start with the pros of buying. There's still truth in the idea of homeownership as part of the financial planning strategy. And I'd start by pointing out that forced saving is a real benefit for a lot of people who just do not have the discipline to save and invest the difference between homeownership and renting. If you pay off your home, that's a big if, and have kept it well maintained, you can genuinely be looking at reduced living expenses down the road. There's a tax advantage. So profits on the sale of a principal residence are generally exempt from capital gains tax. And finally, I would say that there is a psychological security in owning your own home for many people, including me. And I would not underestimate just how incredibly important that is.
There are also cons to a house equals retirement plan strategy. Number one, liquidity. Your home might make you richer on paper, but you can still be struggling with basic living expenses. Number two, there's the risk of housing prices stagnating or even decreasing. We just talked about that. Three, maintenance costs, they never end. Your home is not a passive investment. You have lots of ongoing costs, even when you are mortgage free. And finally, and this is the big one we've been referring to, opportunity cost. A large mortgage may reduce your ability to invest in RSPs, build TFSAs, save for emergency funds, pursue education or business opportunities.
So now let's take a look at how renting plus investing, remember the plus investing part, can also work to build financial wealth and financial resilience. The key benefit to renting is that it's cheaper, and so it frees up money for saving and investing. The upfront cost is generally just first and last month's rent. And beyond that, your monthly rent is where it starts and stops. You aren't
Yep.
responsible for maintenance or major appliance issues, all that kind of stuff. And it's flexible. If your job or your life are likely to change, you can move a lot more easily. I read somewhere somebody put it this way: renting is the maximum that you're going to pay for where you live. Mortgage payments are the minimum.
Ouch. Yeah, and with that, let's look at the con side. You are not building equity. Your rent can increase, especially, if it was a newer build, sometimes by a lot. There are situations under which your landlord can terminate your lease, and I've shared some of my stories. And there can be restrictions on things like renovations. Maybe you're very specific, maybe you're artsy, or whether or not you can have pets, although some buildings don't even allow that, even if you're owner. So the challenge here is that on top of the renting situations, you have to save and invest the difference, and you can look at it as the difference between the rent you pay and what it would cost to own.
And
I
remember,
think
it's total cost, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think the big picture is that housing should be considered as a pillar of your financial strategy, but not the complete strategy, because you're going to have a lot of holes in that. The healthiest strategy generally should include housing stability. And I love that term, right? It's making sure that you have a place to live, diversified investments, and also living a good life, whatever that means to you. Stressing about home ownership shouldn't be one of them. And when you retire, you will have that solid foundation along with added government benefits and hopefully lots of pensions and savings that you put aside.
On that note, time for today's three key learnings.
First, I would say understand your motivation for buying a home. Is it a default decision? Have you looked at other options? Understanding your motivation is the starting point for decision making. If you do decide to go for ownership, ask yourself, how much home do I need? What can I really afford? And how does this decision fit into my overall financial plan?
Second, homeownership should not be your sole retirement plan. You've heard of being house poor? It's a real thing. One thing we see today that's not widely talked about is that much of the wealth of the boomer and Gen X is in home equity, and bricks and mortar do not buy groceries. Liquidity is enormously important.
And finally, remember that renting is a valid option and you should not be shamed to buy it. It is not throwing money away, it's having a place to live. And it's the maximum, like Doretta was saying, that you are going to pay for that privilege. Yes, your rent can increase. Yes, you could have landlord issues, but renting and investing the difference, that's the key here, between renting and buying, including all the costs that home ownership demands, can absolutely provide the flexibility you need to allow you to build a strong financial future.
On that note, that's us for today. Are you thinking about homeownership or have you recently taken the plunge? We'd love to hear about your insights and strategies. Drop us a line or 10 at notjustmoneypodcast@gmail.com.
Well, that wasn't so bad. Good talk. You've been listening to Not Just Money with Doretta and Li. Click on the show's description for links to resources related to today's conversation. Our aim is to share sources that provide objective information that can help you make informed financial decisions. Please rate and review our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, email us at notjustmoneypodcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to be featured on the show, you can send us your questions and comments by a written email, audio file, or video file. Please include your name and city. This show is produced and edited by Li, with original music by Leo Zhang cello and artwork by John Tu. Now for some legalese. Please note that the views expressed by our hosts and guests are theirs alone and should not be viewed as financial advice. This podcast is intended to be entertainment and educational in nature. Please seek additional professional support or information before acting on any podcast information. As always, good talk.